Hey, old-timer, what's that smudge on your arm supposed to be? The voice cut through the respectful quiet of the Memorial Plaza. It was sharp, cocky, and dripped with the unearned confidence of youth. Lieutenant Mason, fresh from BUD/S and convinced he was forged from the same steel as the legends he'd studied, gestured with his chin toward the old man's forearm. The man, who looked as if he'd been carved from weathered oak, sat quietly on a bench, his gaze fixed on the granite wall etched with the names of the fallen. He wore a simple windbreaker, faded jeans, and a pair of worn-out boots that had seen more miles than Mason had seen years. A faded, bluish-black tattoo, blurred by decades of sun and stretching skin, was visible just below his rolled-up sleeve. It was an indistinct shape, a muddle of lines that might have once been something meaningful but was now just a relic. The old man, Silas, didn't turn. He seemed to absorb the insult like a stone absorbs the rain, letting it run off without effect. This only seemed to needle the young SEAL further. "I'm talking to you, Pops. You deaf?" Mason took a step closer, flanked by two of his teammates who smirked, enjoying the show. They were giants in their crisp Navy working uniforms, radiating an aura of controlled lethality. They were the new gods of war, and this old man was just a ghost from a forgotten history. Silas finally turned his head, his movements slow and deliberate. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, held a depth that Mason mistook for senility. "It's old," Silas said, his voice a low rumble, like stones shifting at the bottom of a river. "Old?" Mason scoffed, a laugh bubbling in his chest. "Yeah, I'll say. Looks like you got it done with a rusty nail and some back-alley port. What is it, a botched anchor? A drowning squid?" His buddies chuckled. A few other visitors in the plaza, mostly families and a few off-duty sailors, began to take notice. The confrontation was becoming a spectacle. Silas simply looked at the tattoo on his own arm, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Not sadness, not anger, but something far more ancient. "It meant something once," he replied, his voice still quiet, refusing to rise to the bait. "Everything means something when you're young, I guess," Mason shot back, crossing his muscular arms. He leaned in, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial, condescending whisper. "Look, Grandpa, this is a place for real warriors. For the guys on this wall. For us. We appreciate your patriotism or whatever brought you here, but maybe you should take your faded memories and go find a VFW hall to swap stories in. This is hallowed ground." The implication was clear. You don't belong here. You are not one of us. Silas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He had seen boys like Mason before. He'd seen them full of fire and certainty, boys who believed themselves invincible because they had never truly faced the void. He had seen them break, and he had seen them die. He felt a pang, not of anger, but of a profound, weary sorrow for the lessons this young man still had to learn, and the brutal cost they would inevitably extract. "This ground is for everyone who remembers," Silas said, his voice gaining a sliver of steel. He turned his gaze back to the wall of names, a silent dismissal. The finality in his tone, the sheer lack of deference, was like a slap in the face to Lieutenant Mason. The young officer's face flushed with anger. His pride, the very foundation of his identity as a SEAL, had been pricked. This frail old man, this civilian, was looking through him as if he were nothing more than a noisy child. "Is that so?" Mason's voice hardened, losing its mocking tone and taking on the sharp edge of command he was so proud of. "You want to talk about remembering? We carry the legacy of every man on this wall. We are the tip of the spear. We are the reason you get to sleep safely at night, old man. So you will show me, and my men, the proper respect." He took another step forward, his shadow falling over Silas. The physical intimidation was obvious. His teammates shifted their weight, their presence amplifying the threat. The air grew thick with tension. A mother quickly pulled her young child closer, her eyes wide with alarm. This was no longer a simple case of youthful arrogance. It was escalating into a public display of humiliation, a raw exercise of power. Silas, however, remained unmoved, a granite boulder against a rising tide. He slowly raised his hand and traced the faded lines on his arm. "Respect," he murmured, more to himself than to the furious young officer looming over him, "is a quiet thing. It isn't demanded. It's earned in silence. In the dark, where no one is watching, the words were simple, but they carried a weight that seemed to momentarily stun Mason into silence. It was the wisdom of a man who had seen the dark, and it was utterly alien to the young SEAL's world of valorous, broadcasted glory. The quiet standoff was broken by the rhythmic clap of polished dress shoes on the pavement. The sound was precise, authoritative, and it carried an immediate weight that made every sailor in the plaza instinctively straighten their posture. Heads turned. Lieutenant Mason and his team snapped to attention as if struck by lightning, their confrontation with the old man instantly forgotten. Walking toward them was Rear Admiral Hayes, the base commander. He was a tall man with a face that seemed permanently etched with the gravity of his command. His uniform was immaculate, his chest a constellation of ribbons that told the story of a lifetime at war. He was a living legend in the community, a man who had served in every major conflict for the past 30 years. His presence commanded absolute, unconditional respect. The Admiral's steel-gray eyes swept over the scene, taking in his 3 rigid SEALs and the quiet old man on the bench. An eyebrow arched in silent, dangerous question. "Lieutenant Mason," Admiral Hayes said, his voice calm, but with an undercurrent of cold fury that made the air temperature drop. "Report. What is the meaning of this disturbance?" Mason's face went pale. Being called out by the base commander, especially in front of civilians, was a career-ending nightmare. "Sir," he stammered, his earlier arrogance evaporating into a cloud of panicked adrenaline. "No disturbance, sir. We were just speaking with this civilian." The Admiral's gaze shifted from Mason to Silas. He looked at the old man, taking in the weathered face, the simple clothes, and the quiet dignity that seemed to radiate from him. For a moment, he saw just another elderly veteran, perhaps lost in his memories. His expression was stern, ready to reprimand his men for harassing a civilian on hallowed ground. He opened his mouth to dismiss Mason and apologize to the man, but then his eyes fell on the old man's forearm. He stopped. The words died in his throat. The world seemed to slow down. The Admiral's gaze, trained to identify threats and details from 100 yards, locked onto the faded, blurred tattoo. He took a half-step closer, his head tilting slightly. The smudged ink that Mason had mocked as a drowning squid began to resolve itself in the Admiral's mind, connecting with ghosts of legends and classified files he had only ever read about in hushed, secure rooms. His expression shifted from stern authority to utter, slack-jawed disbelief. Then, to something else entirely. "Oh." The Admiral's face, a mask of command hardened by decades of service, completely transformed. The stern lines softened, replaced by a look of profound, almost fearful reverence. His eyes, fixed on the tattoo, widened. The plaza, the saluting SEALs, the whispering civilians, it all faded away. He saw not a smudge, but a symbol. A trident, not the familiar one of the SEALs, but an older, crueler design, its tines sharp and aggressive. Wrapped around its base was an anchor, but not a standard Navy anchor. This one was fouled with a sea serpent. And above it all, a single, 5-pointed star, nearly lost in the faded ink. It was the sigil of a ghost. A myth. "My God," Admiral Hayes whispered, the words barely audible, a prayer and a curse in one breath. He raised a hand as if to touch the tattoo, but stopped himself, his fingers trembling slightly. He looked from the tattoo to the old man's face, truly seeing him for the first time. He saw the scars, faint white lines around his eyes and on his jaw. He saw the profound stillness that was not the product of age, but of a discipline forged in unimaginable fire. He saw the ghost swimming in those pale blue eyes. Lieutenant Mason and his team stood frozen, utterly bewildered. They had never seen the Admiral look at anyone or anything with such raw emotion. They watched as their commander, a man they considered a demigod of the modern military, seemed to shrink in the presence of this anonymous old man. Then, Admiral Hayes did something that shattered their understanding of the world. He straightened his back, bringing his heels together with a sharp, definitive click. His movements were precise, perfect. He raised his right hand to his brow in a slow, deliberate salute. It was not the perfunctory gesture of a superior officer acknowledging a subordinate. It was the salute of a soldier to a king, the salute of a believer to a living icon. The plaza fell into a stunned, absolute silence. The only sound was the distant cry of a gull and the rustle of the flag in the sea breeze. Mason's jaw hung open. SEALs did not salute old men in faded windbreakers. Admirals did not salute civilians. The universe had been turned upside down. Sentinel, the Admiral said, his voice thick with emotion, his eyes locked on Silas. He held the salute, his arm as steady as a marble column. We thought you were gone. We thought you were all gone. Silas looked up at the Admiral. For the first time, a flicker of a smile touched his lips, a sad, knowing expression. He slowly, a bit stiffly, rose to his feet. He gave the Admiral a slight, respectful nod. The sea doesn't give up its dead easily, Admiral, Silas said. His voice, though quiet, now carried the weight of history. Some of us, we just wash ashore. Admiral Hayes finally lowered his hand, though the look of awe never left his face. He turned to the three statuesque, confused SEALs. His expression hardened again, but this time it was not anger. It was a deep, profound disappointment that was 1,000 times worse. Lieutenant Mason, he began, his voice low and controlled, a storm gathering on the horizon. Do you know who this is? Mason, still reeling, could only shake his head. No, sir, of course, you don't, the Admiral retorted, his voice dripping with ice. They didn't teach you about him at BUD/S. His story isn't in your history books. His unit was never officially acknowledged. Because men like him did their work in the dark, without praise, without medals, and with the expectation of a nameless grave, he gestured towards Silas's arm. You see this tattoo you were so quick to mock? You called it a smudge. A drowning squid, the Admiral's voice was laced with a fury so cold it burned. That, Lieutenant, is the sigil of Task Force Mako, the original Neptune's spear. They were the Pathfinders. The very first frogman tasked with the impossible. Long before the word SEAL ever existed, he took a step closer to his men, his voice dropping even lower, forcing them to lean in. They were a handful of men, handpicked for missions so dangerous, so utterly suicidal, that they were considered expendable from the start. They operated with scavenged gear, no support, and no chance of rescue. They swam into enemy harbors with explosives strapped to their chests. They dismantled mines by hand in freezing water. They were ghosts, sent to do the dirty work that no one else could or would do. The young SEALs exchanged uneasy glances. They had heard whispers, fragmented sea stories about a clandestine unit from the Korean War era, but they were dismissed as myths, tall tales told by old salts. The Admiral wasn't finished. He pointed a finger at the granite wall behind them, the memorial that formed the heart of the plaza. You see those names? Heroes, every one of them. They died honorably, and we remember them. The men of Task Force Mako were never given that luxury. Their service records were sealed, their missions classified to this day. When they died, their families were told it was a training accident. There is no wall for them. There is no memorial. There is only silence. He turned his gaze back to Silas, his eyes softening with a respect that bordered on worship. There were 12 of them. In their final mission, they were sent to neutralize a fortified submarine pen. It was a one-way ticket, and they all knew it. They were betrayed, ambushed. The official report, buried so deep it barely exists, lists 11 men killed in action. The 12th was listed as missing, presumed dead. The Admiral paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the silent plaza. The civilians who had been watching were now captivated, listening with rapt attention as a piece of hidden history was unearthed before their very eyes. The sole survivor, Admiral Hayes continued, his voice now a reverent hush, was known only by his call sign. Sentinel, he held off an enemy counterattack alone for 6 hours, allowing a single, vital piece of intelligence to be retrieved. He was wounded, captured, and spent 2 years in a prison camp that officially didn't exist. When he was finally released, his government, the very nation he sacrificed everything for, disavowed him to maintain plausible deniability. They erased him. He was given a new name, a quiet life, and told to forget he was ever a warrior. The Admiral looked directly at Lieutenant Mason, whose face was now a mask of dawning horror and shame. This man, this old-timer you and your team saw fit to disrespect, is Silas Thorne. He is Sentinel. He is the 12th man. He is the living legacy of a unit whose sacrifice is the very bedrock upon which the SEAL teams were built. Every piece of gear you wear, every tactic you learn, every ounce of respect you command was paid for in advance by him and his brothers. You aren't the tip of the spear, Lieutenant. You are just holding the spear that men like him forged in hell. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence filled with the weight of 70 years of forgotten sacrifice, of unacknowledged heroism. Mason felt as if the ground had fallen out from under him. His arrogance, his pride, his entire identity felt like a cheap costume in the presence of this quiet, unassuming old man. He looked at Silas, at the faded tattoo, and for the first time, he saw it clearly. He saw the serpent, the trident, the star. He saw the ghosts of 11 men standing behind Silas, their eyes fixed on him. The shame was a physical thing, a hot, suffocating weight in his chest. He felt sick. His teammates looked equally devastated, their faces pale, their eyes downcast. They had desecrated their own temple without even knowing it. They had mocked their own creator. The Admiral let the silence hang for a long moment before speaking again, his voice now calm, but impossibly heavy. You three will report to my office at 0600 tomorrow. We are going to have a long, detailed discussion about the meaning of honor, history, and humility. You are going to learn that the strength of a warrior is not measured by the size of his muscles or the sharpness of his tongue, but by the depth of his respect for those who came before him. He then turned his gaze to Mason, and his eyes were full of a terrible, righteous fire. But your education, Lieutenant, begins right now. You will turn to this man. You will stand at attention, and you will give him the apology he is owed. Not just from you, but from a generation of warriors who forgot where they came from. You will look him in the eye, and you will hope that he has more grace in his heart than you have ignorance in your head. Lieutenant Mason's body moved before his mind did. His training took over. He snapped his heels together, his back ramrod straight, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He was at the position of attention, but it was not for the Admiral. He turned to face Silas. His throat was dry, his heart hammering against his ribs. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The shame was a physical gag. All his life, he had prided himself on his courage, his ability to face down any threat without fear. But looking into the pale, calm eyes of this old man was the most terrifying thing he had ever done. He saw in them not anger or judgment, but a vast, weary understanding that was somehow more damning. He saw a man who had endured more pain than Mason could possibly comprehend, and who had carried it with a quiet dignity the young SEAL couldn't even begin to fathom. He took a shaky breath. "Sir," he began, his voice cracking, the word "sir" feeling pitifully inadequate. "Sir, there are no words. My behavior was unforgivable. I was arrogant, disrespectful. I am ashamed. I am so sorry." The apology felt hollow, a child's excuse in the face of a god's silence. He forced himself to continue, to find the right words, even though he knew none existed. "I disrespected you, your service, and the memory of your brothers. I failed to see the giant whose shoulders I stand on. I ask for your forgiveness, sir, though I know I have not earned it." He stood there, braced for a tirade, for a dismissal, for anything but the gentle quiet that followed. Silas looked at the young, broken officer for a long moment. He saw the genuine remorse in his eyes, the crumbling of a boy's hubris into a man's shame. He saw not an enemy, but a successor who had lost his way. He reached out, his old, calloused hand surprisingly steady, and placed it on Mason's shoulder. The young SEAL flinched at the contact, as if touched by lightning. "There is nothing to forgive, son," Silas said, his voice soft, yet carrying across the plaza. "You are young. You are full of fire. That fire is necessary for the work you do. But fire, untended, burns down the house it's meant to warm." He squeezed the young man's shoulder gently. "Your penance isn't to apologize to me. It's to remember. Remember that the loudest man in the room is often the weakest. Remember that true strength is quiet. And remember the men who came before you, not as legends in a book, but as brothers. Carry their silence with you. That is how you honor them." Silas removed his hand and gave a slight nod to the Admiral. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his steps slow but steady, melting back into the crowd and disappearing, a ghost returning to the shadows. The plaza remained silent for a long time after Silas was gone. Lieutenant Mason stood frozen, the imprint of the old man's hand still burning on his shoulder. Silas's words echoed in his mind, not as a rebuke, but as a profound and painful lesson. He felt as if he had been stripped bare, his identity remade in the crucible of his own shame. Admiral Hayes watched him, his expression unreadable. He let the young officer stew in his own humility. Finally, he spoke, his voice no longer angry, but tired. He gave you a gift, Lieutenant. A second chance. Most men in your position wouldn't get one. Don't waste it. The Admiral turned to the other two SEALs. You two with me. Lieutenant Mason, you will remain here until sunset. You will stand and face that wall, and you will reflect on every name etched into that stone. You will think about the 11 names that aren't there, and you will contemplate the meaning of the word service. Without waiting for a reply, the Admiral walked away, his two charges following him like chastened children. Left alone, Mason slowly turned to face the memorial wall. The setting sun cast long shadows across the plaza, making the etched names glow like embers. He read them, one by one. He saw not just names, but stories, sacrifices. He thought of Task Force Mako, of 11 men who died in anonymity, and the one who lived to carry their silence. He stood there for hours as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky turning from orange to purple to a deep, star-dusted black. He didn't move. He didn't flinch. He just stood, a sentinel at his post, his education finally, truly beginning. He had come to this place as a proud Navy SEAL, an inheritor of a great legacy. He would leave it as something more. He would leave it as a humble guardian of a sacred memory, forever changed by the quiet dignity of a man with a faded tattoo and the ghosts he carried. His own journey as a true warrior had just started, not in the surf and sand of BUD/S, but right here, in the humbling shadow of a forgotten hero. He would carry that silence. He would honor them all,